Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone. Well, in today's episode, I thought it was worthy of having a discussion about the death of the Regressive Left, which I think is something that we are seeing unfolding before us. Why do I think that the Regressive Left is now dying? Well, probably there's 5 different factors that I can see that are hallmarks, consistent hallmarks now of the Regressive Left thinking and activity, which all indicate that things are well and truly on a downward spiral for them. So first of all, there is a lot of superficiality going on. People who are only really addressing issues at a superficial level, only really doing superficial things and then trying to claim them as some sort of serious acts of activism. Even the other night at the Milo Yiannopoulos riot, there were people there who were taking selfies of themselves in front of the burning light tower, and it was just all felt so narcissistic and what's the word, that probably easy. It's just too easy. There's no real sacrifice, there's no real commitment. It's just very superficial. It doesn't seem like there is a lot of depth of thought going on behind this movement, which leads me to the second reason why I think they're dying. It's not really underpinned by any objective principles. And the reason I say that is because they constantly are violating what are supposedly the principles that they are committed to as core values. So, for example, tolerance is the most obvious example, where they constantly talk about tolerance and fighting for tolerance, but they do that in the most intolerant way possible, even to the point of using force or using violence or denying other people the right to even speak. What that tells me is that there is no one or no consistent group of people at the heart of that movement which is saying, hold on a minute, if we're really truly committed to a set of first principles that are objectively true, then they should be true for us as well as for the people that we are demanding them of, but that clearly isn't the case. Number 3, obviously that results in a lot of hypocrisy. There is a lot of hypocrisy going on in the Regressive Left. A really classic example of this, once again, at the Milo Yiannopoulos riot the other night, was the people who were holding up signs about, opposing and stopping fascism. And their way of stopping fascism was by shutting down someone else's right to freedom of speech, by destroying public property, by doing violence to other people, by lighting things on fire. It was just this glaring moment of hypocrisy, and if it had been the only one, you could say it was just a one-off incident, but it's not. I think the Milo Yiannopoulos riot probably was a bit of a tipping point, actually, and it's been an ongoing thing that's been happening for many months now, and has really started to come to a head. Point number 4, often they are just hysterical. And what I mean by that is they, instead of actually stopping and understanding what the opposition's argument is or what their position truly is, they just go to hysteria now. They will take half information. They're not really listening to what people are, the arguments that are being put to them. They tend to go to the sort of worst case, hysterical sort of extreme. Everyone is Hitler, everyone is a fascist, everyone is trying to bring about the downfall of civilization. It's just more and more hysteria rather than actual solid philosophical substance which underpins what they're actually doing. And then the last, and I think most important thing, is now the increasing regularity of violence that is starting to become a hallmark of the Regressive Left. Now, the Regressive Left always used force. They've always used force to try and compel people. The question around marriage redefinition, gay marriage, they were more than happy to use force on people to try and prevent them having the right to freedom of conscience. The abortion issue, they've been doing this for a long time, trying to pressure people out of jobs or out of various other positions if they don't go along with a particular ideology. So they've used force for a long time, but now in the last 6 months to a year, it's really, last 6 months particularly, it's actually become violence now, and violence is sort of the hallmark of what's going on. Now, violence is an interesting moment, I think, in a movement, because coercion and violence, what they indicate is that your movement is dying. Your movement does not have mainstream public support. If it did, you would not need to use coercive tactics. You wouldn't need to force people to do things. You wouldn't need to compel them by force of the law. You definitely wouldn't need to use violent rioting and other things. because people would be on side with what you were doing. They would be in your corner. The laws would reflect that. The culture would reflect that. Well, it doesn't. And so this is the last sort of gasp of a dying ideology when it's really on its deathbed, however long that takes. There is a tendency to go towards violence and force to try and make people do things that they're not naturally wanting to do anyway. Now, some people are saying, hold on, Brendan, it's not really them, or it's not really us, committing acts of violence. Maybe it's the Antifa guys, or the Black Bloc, or it's the anarchists, and they just happen to be turning up to these events and doing these things. Well, that's not. I don't think that's really the case. I wanted to be really well informed about what happened at the Milo Yiannopoulos event, so I actually watched the replay of the BuzzFeed live news feed. They had a constant live video stream going. It's about 2 hours, 2 and a bit hours. And I after I put the kids to bed last night, I sat down and I watched the whole thing, or most of the thing, because I wanted to know and get my head around, not just having people tell me what happened, but I wanted to actually see for myself what happened so I could really grasp the scope of what it was. And I was astounded. Absolutely astounded. Beyond just the concept of turning up en masse to shut down someone's right to freedom of speech, which is the exact opposite of what tolerance is supposed to be about. But on top of that, there was just this violence and pointlessness and superficiality. And yes, there were anarchists who were throwing fireworks and were burning things and all the rest of it. But there were other people there who were joining in. And not only that, but the crowd was cheering them on. To me, this is kind of like saying, it's not us that's killing all those Jews. It's the Nazis that do that. We just follow the law and we just hand over the Jews, but we're not doing anything bad to them. It's kind of like, well, hold on, at what point do you actually own up to the fact that your movement, because I have heard no strong, sustained criticism and condemnation from the regressive left about this violence. There are isolated voices on the progressive or leftist side of the spectrum, but they're definitely sort of more, I would say they're more centrist voices rather than leftist voices, but there is no sustained criticism. And the crowd was willing, as I said, to cheer this sort of stuff along. And then the day after, we have Sarah Silverman posting that tweet about, calling people to arms against Trump and celebrating what had gone on. I mean, there's no doubting that violence has now become part of what the regressive left is. It's just happening so very often. The other night, the Screen Actors Guild Award, and the creators and actors from the show Stranger Things, which I really love, by the way, great show, and I will be watching season 2. But they give this speech and they talk about opposing bullies, and it's all very sort of stock standard stuff. And then they get to the end and they talk about, and if all else fails, we're going to start punching people in the face. And the crowd stands up to their feet and starts celebrating this call to violence. And, when you're seeing stuff like that, that there is some very, very serious trouble afoot and that a movement really is on its way out. So the important question, though, is what happens next? Because this really is the key and vitally important question. As far as I'm concerned, this can really only go one of two ways. We could end up with a return to classical liberalism, a more classical type of liberalism, one where natural law plays more of a role, where there's sound philosophy underpinning what's going on, where there's actual thought, not superficiality. There's real substance going on there, where people actually do respect genuine tolerance for diversity of ideas, where people are willing to have a public discourse, not a toxic it's not even a shouting match, it's now an abusing match most of the time. They are simply abusing people they disagree with. Where violence has no part of it, where there is the right to freedom of conscience is actually respected. So that's one way it could go, and that's what I'm hopeful will start to happen, that more people will move back that way, and they will actually have that ability to say, you know what, those Christians have got different ideas, and even though I might totally disagree with them, they're totally entitled to have those ideas and practice those things and even talk about them in the public square. I think that's a really good thing. And meanwhile, the people on the Christian side are going, yeah, those atheists, I disagree with them on questions about the existence of God and maybe morality and stuff like that. But you know what? They still have human dignity. They're still part of our community. They have every right to hold their ideas and to speak about them in the public square. And so on and so on and so on. And I think that would be the ideal outcome, but it's not the only outcome. There is a far more frightening possibility, and that is the possibility that we end up with the extreme far right starting to take dominance. And that would be truly frightening, but it is very, very, very possible that that could be an outcome. Basically, the regressive left is currently putting all of the ingredients necessary for that to be an outcome into the bowl and mixing it around quite vigorously. Now, what comes out of the oven once that mixture has been put on the tray and put in the oven, what comes out the other end is, well, who knows? It really is dependent on a lot of factors. But there's no doubt that they are definitely doing things which will almost certainly, and I've seen evidence for that, I've spoken to people, I've read articles, there is definitely only so much abuse and intolerance that ordinary, everyday good people will take before they start getting really fed up and saying, well, I feel that I have to start going towards a community or a group that is actually going to listen to me and is not going to be espousing this nonsense and is also critiquing it. Now, there are two groups doing that. There is that sort of that classical liberal group who have got a sound philosophical underpinning to what they're doing, and then there are the far-right groups who are being driven by their own problematic and hateful ideologies as well. And it's anyone's guess which way someone will go. But the thing is that they'll only put up with that kind of abuse and intolerance for so long. So, what do we do then? Well, here's my suggestions. If you are someone who is on the regressive left and you are starting to have doubts about the regressive left, or you're just feeling really uncomfortable with what's going on, or you know this isn't good and something's got to change, then I would encourage you to start reading your Edmund Burke. Start reading up about natural law ethics, learning those principles and understanding them again. I would say you need to actually read and listen to the arguments that are being put forward by the other side. And not only that, but respect and defend their right to freedom of conscience and freedom of expression. Don't just go along with the mob. Don't just use your social media page to expand the bubble or to pull yourself further into that bubble. Actually present diversity of ideas, or when others are mocking diversity of ideas, actually challenge them on their mockery. You don't have to agree with what's being said, but certainly if we're going to have a just, stable and civil society, we actually need to respect each other's right to have a voice and to listen to each other. Now that means sometimes you're going to have to put up with things that you might not like, so ideas and opinions that you might even strongly disagree with, but that's the reality of having a just, stable civil society. You have to accept that there are going to be these grey edges. You have to give the freedom to actually allow people to speak their mind, even if what they're saying is flat out wrong or flat out vile and ugly. Because the other alternative is just far too dangerous. The other alternative is that you have a society in which only those who hold the strings of power get to decide what is spoken about and what is not spoken about. They control the speech, they control the thought, they police and they punish people for not presenting the ideas that they, the powerful, think and think are acceptable. Anything the powerful don't accept, we are not allowed to accept either. And that's an extremely problematic society. So you've got to allow those sort of messy grey edges. To do that, you've actually got to respect and defend other people's right to speak and have a voice on these issues. So, as I said, even if you don't agree with someone, it's important that you actually speak up and defend it. I would say listen and read their arguments and don't misrepresent your opposition. I've lost count of the number of times I've heard people, even in the media, referring to Milo Yiannopoulos, just as one example, as an alt-right speaker or an alt-right provocateur or an alt-right figure. He is not alt-right. Far from it. He's definitely a provocateur. He definitely attracts controversy because he speaks his mind and says things to those who often hold positions of power that are not particularly popular. But he's not alt-right. He's Jewish and he's gay. So what about people who are on the other side of this issue? So those people who have found themselves becoming the targets of these attacks and outbursts from the regressive left, or maybe you've sat in the middle but you find yourself more and more disenfranchised by the dogmatism and the intolerance. Well, I would say some of the same things to you. So I would say that I think it's really important to remember those first principles, that you need to fight hard and fight really hard that urge to embrace far-right ideologies and to engage in any intolerant, hateful violence of your own, because that is not the solution to this problem. And embracing the far-right, effectively you are trading off one hateful and vile ideology and approach for another. That's not the way forward. That's not good for society. I would say that once again, like before, you also need to make sure that you're reading your Edmund Burke and your natural law principles. You understand the first principles that we're on about, and you are consistently applying them. That you are defending the right of even those people on the left we disagree with to actually have their right to freedom of speech, and you're engaging with the ideas of people who disagree with you. You're actually listening and seeing the evidence and hearing the arguments they're making, rather than just, once again, locking yourself in your own version of the bubble. And it's so fundamentally important that we respect people's right to freedom of conscience and freedom of expression. They are pivotal and foundational traits and qualities that have allowed the West to flourish. This respect for basic human dignity, the human dignity of every single person. We are not some sort of collectivist group, where you are part of the Borg, and if you're not part of the Borg, you are not tolerated. And it's really important that we don't fall for that either, even in those of us who are sitting on the other side of this issue, or who are not buying into the regressive leftist thought. And I think, again, it's profoundly important to actually listen to people. It's very easy to see the violence and the intolerance and all of the ugly stuff that's coming out of the regressive left at the moment, and to forget that there are a lot of people who are genuinely good people who are caught up in this, who are looking for truth and who are looking to try and be compassionate human beings. Unfortunately, they've been sold a bill of goods, and that's not going to change if we treat them with the same disdain that they have been treating people who disagree with them. I think we need to show by the way we live our lives that classical liberalism, that approach of respecting individual conscience, individual expression, is actually something real that we truly do value, because we live it out and we respect their right to conscience and individual expression. And it's only when they see it lived out and they see people actually showing them a better way, I think, that a lot of people are going to realise that it's time to move away from this dying beast as it sort of gasps its last gasp. So there you go. What comes next is totally uncertain. I don't know what the answer is, and part of me is there's a bit of trepidation there, and part of me is a little bit scared, because it could go to a really problematic place. Violence does tend to breed violence if it's left unchecked, and there is always that factor of, the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every person, and that's the reality of it. But there is also the hopeful part of me, and the hopeful part of me says that I hope that we can actually find a more respectful and truly tolerant way forward, that we can actually begin to remember again those first principles, and we can remember objective truth and move away from the relativism, the destructive relativism of the regressive left. If enough of us can start living out these principles and the way that we engage with others and the way we dialogue, I think we can see the return to the public square of a more genuinely humane and intelligent public discourse, instead of this toxic abuse and violence that now just seems to have become the norm. But as I said, there's always a risk it could go the other way, and that's not going to happen. That hopeful outcome that I think probably all of us would hope for is not going to happen unless we all start doing our part. It's not someone else out there who has to change this, it's us. If it doesn't begin with us and the way we respect or don't respect other people, particularly those who disagree with us or we disagree with strongly, then there is no way we can expect this to ever change. As the famous G.K. Chesterton once said, when the editor of a local paper posed the question, what's wrong with the world? There's a story about how he sent a letter to the editor saying, "Dear sir, you asked what's wrong with the world? I am. Yours sincerely, G.K. Chesterton." And I think that's the thing we always have to keep in mind. The responsibility for change lies within each of us. And that means we have to, and it's not just some sort of weird fake activism or some feel-good sentimentality. That change has to begin with our behaviour, the way we interact with other people, the way we treat those, particularly those who disagree with us. Thanks for watching. See you next time on Left Foot Media.